At this point, we don't know what led to the flipped Delta Airlines plane at Pearson Airport. Despite all the videos you're probably seeing of blowing snow, we can't even say if weather was a factor at all. There are just too many possible variables. But as a meteorologist and a private pilot, let me tell you, we are always thinking about weather and managing variables, especially during those last few minutes before landing. Here's what we know about the weather conditions at the time. We have meteorological data from Pearson Airport 12 minutes before the crash. This is a METAR, short for Meteorological Aerodrome Report, used mainly by meteorologists and pilots for current observations of the weather. It says winds were coming from the west steady at 52 kilometers per hour, gusting to 65 kilometers per hour, with reports of blowing snow but fairly good visibility. We also know the plane was landing on runway 23. Runway numbers line up with compass degrees, so 230 is landing towards the southwest. So we always try to land into the wind. It slows the plane down faster, and in a controlled busy airport like Pearson, the tower is going to pick what runways are closest to landing straight into the wind and let all the planes know. In this case, there were a couple of active runways. The closest Delta could get to landing straight into the wind was runway 23, but that meant winds were coming at them from a 40-degree angle from their right. When coming into land with winds that are blowing from a direction that is not directly head-on, that's called a crosswind landing. And there are a couple different ways as a pilot you can account for that. You can crab or angle your nose towards the wind a little so you don't get blown off course. So the plane is lined up with the runway even if the nose isn't. You can side slip by putting one wing a little lower into the wind to keep you in line. And to keep the plane from turning, you also have to engage the tail controls, the rudder, in an opposite direction. In both cases, this means some juggling of the control surfaces while landing and ultimately straightening the plane out in those final moments before touchdown. It's something that pilots do all the time. Different aircraft have different wind and wind angle limits that manufacturers and airlines recommend landing in. That's because you don't want to put too much strain on the landing gear if the plane ends up touching down a little sideways. The standard crosswind procedure in this type of plane, the CRJ 900, is to crab into the crosswind and to decrab just before touchdown. What actually happened, we don't know. We do know that based on flight tracking details from flight radar, this plane's final descent rate was quite fast. A normal descent rate is about 400 feet per minute, and in this case, it was around 1,000 feet per minute, more than twice as fast. The rate of descent caught my eye because this plays into what we call the flaring. This is a maneuver that every pilot does in the last few seconds. By gently pulling the nose back, you slow down the rate of descent, the plane's main wheels touch down first, and you generally get a softer landing. But the faster the descent, the harder it is to pull this off. There's one more piece of information that we have that investigators will be looking at, and that's the state of the runway. Was it icy? Was it snowy? Remember, Toronto had just been hit by a massive snowstorm the day before. A notice was issued to all flight personnel in the area that same day, what we call a NOTAM, giving details about the state of the runway given the recent snow and gusting winds. Runway 23 was complicated. Most of the cleared portion of the runway was a combo of dry snow patches and dry compacted snow patches. But the runway was not cleared all the way to the edges. Normally, this is a 200-foot wide runway, but only a 160-foot wide path was cleared. On either side, it would have looked white. So approaching this runway would have looked narrower or farther away than it normally would be fully cleared. But again, we can't say if this was a factor. Ultimately, we can't say if any of these weather conditions were a factor in what happened. But as investigators from the Canadian Transport Safety Board work to find answers, we know weather will be one of their questions. We know even though pilots are trained to deal with all kinds of scenarios, this kind of weather can add a layer of complexity to any flight. I'll be watching this investigation closely to see what we can all learn from it.